Good morning, and welcome to the 48th meeting of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. Normally, we meet in a more intimate room, and so I don't have to exert the voice so much, but we're very happy to be here today. But before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my friend from Sackville Eastern Shore, Peter Stauffer, for the excellent work you did chairing the last couple of meetings of this committee. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to congratulate you, Sir Peter. And for the record, His Majesty the King William Alexander of the Netherlands has recently knighted our colleague Peter Stauffer for his services to both the Netherlands and to Canada. Aujourd'hui, nous avons l'honneur de recevoir.
Today we have the honor of having as our witness the Minister of Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Aaron O'Toole, as well as his Deputy Minister, Mr. Walter Natinchuk.
Sit there, and I remember we both behaved when we sat there, so I want you to see that the work we did when we sat there is an inspiration to all members here, because they're all going to behave throughout this meeting. Not just because I'm holding the gavel. Now, the Minister will make a 10-minute presentation, and then committee members will each have 6 or 7 minutes to direct their questions to the Minister and to the Deputy, who obviously also outranks him. The record should show that we have here the Minister, the Deputy Minister, and the Parliamentary Secretary, and the lowest rank is the Minister. So, veuillez noter que Monsieur O'Toole.
Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Natinchuk will be with us for 90 minutes, and therefore we will adjust our timing in light of that.
Monsieur le Président, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I remember fondly in my first year in Parliament being a part of this standing committee. It's good to see yourself and the clerk. Some of the members of the opposition were at the committee at that time, and some of my colleagues in the Conservative caucus. And it is an honor for me to be back appearing before you as Minister, particularly after a profound period of progress and reform in the last number of months. I'm also joined, as you said, by my Deputy, Walter Natinchuk, General Retired. You did steal my joke, Mr. Chair, about the General Retired being my deputy to an average retired captain. I'm very fortunate to have Walt and have long known his passion for military families and for veterans. I also, from my department, have some senior leaders here that will have additional information should the committee require it. I have Bernard Butler, Director General of Policy, Michel Douaran, the ADM for Service Delivery, and Maureen Sinnott, Director General of Finance. And I want to start my remarks that my time on this committee was formative in my development as a parliamentarian and the knowledge base I'm working from as Minister of Veterans Affairs. Your reports, both at the time I served on the committee and the report on the new Veterans Charter, have been formative in my consideration of legislation and reform. All of the 54 witnesses that appeared before this committee as part of your intensive look at the new Veterans Charter, I want to thank them. Some are here in the audience today. And then my background before Parliament. As many people know, I did serve 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Proud of that time, and then when leaving uniform, worked in the nonprofit and support our troops and veterans area with my Legion, Branch 178, with the True Patriot Love Foundation that I helped create with some other passionate Canadians, and then working alongside amazing Canadians from coast to coast, some who've served, some who have not served, in groups organizing walks, Wounded Warriors, Treble Victor, I'm wearing their pin today, Canada Company. This is the background I bring and why I was so honored when the Prime Minister asked me to serve in this role. Mon équipe a travaillé avec les groupes des anciens.
My team has worked with veterans, the Ombudsman for Veterans, and also with Veterans Affairs Canada. The work that was done by General retired Walt Natinchuk, now Deputy Minister, has certainly been of great help.
And all veterans groups for giving me your priorities and working with me going forward. Your study on the new Veterans Charter was an important one, and the most important finding beyond your 14 recommendations was the fact that the approach to wellness, transition, and support for the veteran and their family is sound. In fact, I think on page 9 of your report, you urged keeping the new Veterans Charter and its approach to transition. But you did clearly say that there needed to be a better charter with fixes. In fact, it was on page 2. It works for most veterans, as you said, but most is not enough, to quote your report. I agree most is not enough. And so the new Veterans Charter brought in by the last Liberal government, implemented starting in 2006 by the Harper government, reformed in 2011 by the Harper government with the addition of the Permanent Impairment Allowance Supplement, leading up to Bill C-58, now before Parliament, introduced the end of March, which is the most comprehensive update to address some of the issues where the Veterans Charter was not meeting all. It was meeting most, as your committee report showed, but we need to fix gaps to make sure it serves veterans and their families and strives for excellence in that regard. Je suis très heureux que le projet...
I'm very happy that Bill C-58, an act to support veterans and their families, was introduced in the House of Commons and is bringing about essential improvements to the new Veterans Charter.
On the work of this committee in your study on the Veterans Charter and addresses some of the gaps that were highlighted over the last few years by the Ombudsman, by several veteran stakeholders, and last June by this committee. I'll go through those briefly now, which are before Parliament awaiting approval. The Retirement Income Security Benefit, perhaps the most urgent fix needed for the Veterans Charter, highlighted clearly by the Ombudsman, highlighted by the Royal Canadian Legion, NATO veterans, a range of other stakeholders, and it was a problem on the horizon, Mr. Chair. Very few to know new Veterans Charter veterans are 65 now, but it was clear as some of them hit the age of 65 and they lost their earnings loss benefit, they would have a steep decline in their income in their retirement years, post-65. That was an unintended gap in the Veterans Charter when the income supplement of earnings loss ended. So we've remedied that gap, particularly for those who served in the military, were injured, and did not have pensionable time to provide them with pensionable income at that stage of life. So the Retirement Income Security Benefit will kick in at 65 to ensure in retirement there's a predictable amount of financial security for the rest of that veteran's life based on 70% of their pre-65 Veterans Affairs revenue. Important to note, it's the survivability is sound in this. So the surviving spouse does get some financial security on the death of the service member, something that did not exist with the exceptional incapacitation allowance under the old system, Mr. Chair. So we're learning. We are very proud that we've addressed that with a retirement income security benefit. The second benefit in C-58 is the critical injury benefit. That's a benefit that will pay $70,000 to a veteran who's been injured in a sudden traumatic event. And this is another area where the new Veterans Charter did not foresee all circumstances of men and women injured from service. The disability award in the Veterans Charter, the so-called lump sum, is calculated when the recovery of that veteran takes place and their permanent disability over a lifetime is assessed. What that disability award did not take into consideration was the pain and suffering of recovery, the multiple surgeries, time in intensive care, time in recovery themselves after these surgical interventions. There was no recognition of that and no pain and suffering compensation for that. It's an area where the critical injury benefit will address that gap. Also in C58, the Family Caregiver Relief Benefit for the most seriously injured, where a caregiver in the home, a spouse or even an adult child, is really becoming the informal caregiver to that veteran. Veterans Affairs will often pay for a professional contract caregiver in a home and supports, but we all know those are 9 to 5 accommodations, and the new normal for families living with a serious injury changes their life. So this will give relief by providing that family member of almost $8,000 tax-free a year to use in any way that helps them overcome some of the challenges of caregiver fatigue. We know that all families bear the stresses of an injury, mental or physical, in the household. We've been trying to address that through additional counseling for family members for operational stress injuries, support for the families, use of the family resource centers for veterans and their families upon release. And this latest Family Caregiver Relief Benefit is yet another benefit intended to help the families of the most seriously injured. And this is an area I will continue to explore as Minister, because I know the critical role family plays in the wellness of a veteran. We've also expanded and made eligibility criteria easier for the permanent impairment allowance, adding approximately 305 new veterans to that lifetime permanent impairment allowance payment. That's another element that was recommended in your Standing Committee report last June. We've also implemented what I called Respect for the Reserves, to remind Canadians that without the men and women who serve in our reserve units across the country, we would not have the capability of the Canadian Armed Forces we have today. So we've ensured that Class A and Class B reservists receive the same earnings loss benefit entitlement as regular force or Class C. It's about respect. Just a few days ago, it was a year from our National Day of Honor, celebrating the 12-year mission in Afghanistan and honoring the sacrifice. 25% of those people were reservists. We've also added at least an additional 100 case managers and 100 benefit adjudicators to deal with some of the backlogs. Ces modifications sont des améliorations.
These changes represent change for the better, for the system, for the services, and for the programs that veterans need to be able to successfully transition into civilian life.
Time is up. I see my time is up. So colleagues, I urge support of C58. I want to thank the Standing Committee, the Ombudsman, and veterans. I appreciated that you came together with your recommendations. Since we've moved on many, I hope we can pass C58, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. Stauffer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm good to see you're back in the chair, sir. Thank you, and I thank the Minister and the Deputy Minister very much for appearing for us today, and I thank both of you gentlemen for the fine work and representation you did on Canada's behalf recently in the Netherlands for the 70th anniversary, and I thank you both very much for that. Minister, I just received an email from Gord Jenkins, and it's regarding Bill 58 and what you told him. Bill 58 was introduced by the government, and yet we haven't seen second reading of the bill yet. It hasn't even come to this committee yet. Yet in the email to him, you're referring that the opposition parties are delaying these reforms. Mr. Minister, with great respect, you introduced the bill. The government introduced the bill. It hasn't been brought before this committee. In fact, this committee's had 2 cancellations. We've been asking for Bill 58 to come to the committee. We've got some amendments, and we've indicated to the parliamentary secretary we could pass the bill fairly quickly. But we can't do that unless we actually have the bill come before committee. We understand now that you've indicated that this bill will not be part of the budget bill, which means that this bill does not have to come to the committee, that it will all be wrapped up in the budget omnibus bill, which basically means that no veteran, no veterans organization, not even the opposition, will have an opportunity to debate this bill in committee. Mr. Chairman, I find it rather unusual, after 18 years of being in the House of Commons, when a government, either Liberal or Conservative, introduce a bill, that it doesn't come before the appropriate committee for what we're supposed to do. Review it, look at it, pass it. And if you wanted clear passage of this bill, we've already indicated that we like this bill. There's some changes that have to happen. There's no question. We have some amendments for it. I've indicated that before, but, sir, we haven't seen the bill. So can you explain to me how the opposition is holding up this legislation when we haven't even got the bill before committee?
Well, thank you, Mr. Sover. Certainly, you do have many years here in Ottawa sitting both on SCONVA and on this committee. In fact, you're the only member of this committee who voted for the new Veterans Charter. I've made a commitment to veterans to get these reforms passed before this Parliament rises. That is my commitment. Most of Bill C-58 was recommended by this committee. So the substance of the bill actually came from this committee. The 54 witnesses I referred to all supported these reforms and want to move on them. 2 years ago, the Ombudsman recommended what has become the Retirement Income Security Benefit. My concern, and with all due respect, is the committees have talked about this since your early years on the new Veterans Charter and the Veterans Affairs Committee. We need action. It's fair comment to say there's more to do, and I've said this is a living charter and there will be more to do, but these reforms are important. These are benefits and programs for veterans and their families that I've told them, including Mr. Jenkins, that they will pass in this Parliament. My initial discussions, including emails sent to me by veterans that you've sent out, indicate that you would prefer more committee time, more study, and ultimately delay of these benefits before July. I won't allow that to happen. You can fairly comment that there's more to do, Mr. Stouffer, but since most of Bill C-58 are your recommendations, I hope to goodness we can get these passed. C-58 is still on the order paper, but now with your opposition day motion yesterday, challenging the priorities of Bill C-58, I guess, is the only thing I could see that day really tried to do. It's clear you wanted to delay, and I won't allow delay to happen when I've made a commitment to veterans.
Well, Mr. Minister, with great respect for the position you hold, that is simply not true. We in the opposition, I can't speak for the Liberals, have never indicated a delay of Bill 58. And to indicate that we have is simply not true. But I have another question for the Deputy Minister. Deputy Minister, is Mr. John Larley of the Veterans Review and Appeal Board still employed by the Veterans Review and Appeal Board? John Larley.
John Larley, stop.
I missed the question. You're asking whether he's still employed?
Yes, sir.
No, he completed his tenure just a few weeks ago.
Very good. Thank you very much. And the last question for you. I know you can't give an answer right now, a complete one, but is it possible to have from the department a complete analysis of how much money the government plans to save because Korean and World War II veterans are very quickly passing on, and they're not using the facilities of these long-term care beds like at Camp Hill, the Pearly, Colonel Belcher, etc. Can the government give us an estimate of how much money they plan on saving because of the fact that these individuals will no longer be using those services because they won't be with us? If it's possible in the future to have that kind of estimate would be most helpful. And I believe my time is up.
You got another 35 seconds.
35 seconds. Well, okay, then I'll end on a positive note. I just wanted to tell the committee that the other day, last Monday in Halifax, we had our 70th anniversary commemoration, and the minister was very kind enough to send me his speech, because he couldn't be there, he's in the Netherlands. And I think it's the first time that I recall that an opposition critic actually read the minister's speech to a crowd of about 400 to 500 people. So I just want to thank the minister for that opportunity. But don't forget, we aren't letting you off on 58, by the way. Thank you so much.
I thank you, and certainly I'm not sure if I should refer to you as Sir Peter or how you've got the Prime Minister to grant you an exemption from the nickel resolution.
No worries.
But certainly I'm very proud of the Dutch-Canadian community who in Canada have kept the memory of the liberation alive. Certainly going to the Netherlands, as you have in the past, to see how the Dutch people keep it alive. So I want to thank you for making sure there was a special event in Halifax. And I do think that on C-58, as I said, this is a living charter. I think C-58 and our reforms from 2011 shows that it's up to us to make sure that we constantly meet the needs of veterans and their families today and in the future. So I've said fair comment to say what are our next priorities, but C-58 needs passage in this Parliament. I've made that commitment, and that's why it's included in the budget implementation, to make sure that I have that backup plan.
I'd just like to advise the committee that the last 6 minutes lasted 7 minutes. Monsieur Lemieux.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being with us today. I'd also like to thank you, I guess, for referencing or directing your comments to the legislation that is in front of the House. And I want to thank you for your commitment to have it passed before we rise at the end of this session. I think that that's extremely important. Otherwise, there were just promises never delivered upon. So I think that that's critical. And I would say to Mr. Stauffer, Chair, that it's in the Budget Implementation Act. In the past, what's happened is the portions that belong or that pertain to a particular committee, for example, the veterans portions in the Budget Implementation Act that would pertain to this committee will probably be sent to this committee. We have to wait to see what the Finance Committee decides, but I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, this committee will review the clauses in the Budget Implementation Act that refer to the comments the Minister made today about the new initiatives and passing them into law. Minister, I'd just like to ask you a question about Bill C-58, about legislation in front of the House, and that has to do with the critical injury benefit. I think it's a great initiative, but I think that it could be misunderstood, for example, when compared to the disability award. And there was a great example that was given at the time of the announcement of a soldier who would collect the critical injury benefit. But I'm wondering if you could just elaborate for the committee the difference between the critical injury benefit and the disability award.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lemieux. The critical injury benefit was meant to address something that the disability award did not, which is those cases where someone suffered a traumatic injury, but because they made a full recovery, their compensation under the disability award, the lump sum as it's known, was very low. And in fact, all members of this committee can point to veterans that would fall into that category. So veterans that spent time in the Royal 3 Hospital in Afghanistan, in Germany, in intensive care, sometimes multiple operations, but because they had a positive recovery, because our Royal 3 Hospital in Afghanistan was one of the best in the world, their recovery put them at a disadvantage under the New Veterans Charter Disability Award. I don't want to name names, but we can all think of cases where someone had that injury and got a very low disability award. That actually impacted their wellness because they took that to mean that the system did not acknowledge that traumatic period of pain and suffering and recovery. So the critical injury benefit is meant to try and address that. At the same time, it also addresses some of the most seriously injured men and women from Afghanistan. But the critical piece is it's now compensating for the pain and suffering of recovery. It's in addition to the disability award, and it very much also could apply while the person's still in the Canadian Armed Forces recovering. It's a quick payment, and the hope is they recover and stay in the Canadian Armed Forces, but it's an inherent pain and suffering and recognition award. It is meant to be very targeted. The new Veterans Charter, the biggest challenge that The Ombudsman has pointed out the myths that have developed around the new Veterans Charter, that there's only this lump sum and that's all a veteran gets. We're all trying to dispel that myth because it's not fair to Canadians to leave them with that impression. What the new Veterans Charter does is it focuses on transition, so early rehabilitation and financial and medical support. And then for the more moderately to severely injured, it stacks benefits on top of one another. That makes it a little more complex. So there's a disability award, there's potentially a critical injury benefit, then the veteran will get earnings loss while they're doing rehabilitation, an earnings loss benefit, which is an income supplement. They may get permanent impairment allowance. They may get permanent impairment allowance supplement. For many of them at 65, they will then get the retirement income security benefit. So as you see, it's a stacking approach. What we're trying to do for the most seriously injured is to streamline those stacked benefits, the PIAS and RISB, into a single pension for the most seriously injured.
Right. Thank you very much. And so, the example that was given, for example, with the critical injury benefit was a paratrooper whose chute doesn't deploy properly. He's injured upon landing and undergoes multiple surgeries. But after a 1 or 2 year, let's say, recovery period, his disability is small, but he went through 1 to 2 years of significant recovery and trauma. And you're saying the critical injury benefit would be of great benefit to him because of that traumatic period of recovery, whereas the disability award might actually be small because if he recovers, for the most part, then the disability award would be small.
That's exactly it. Well put. And apart from the payment itself, which is significant, but in many ways it's less important than the recognition. The man or woman injured in service to their country, Reg Force or Reserve, needs to know their country respects and recognizes not just that they were injured in the service to their country, but their road to recovery. As you said, the 2 years in that example of a paratrooper, of surgery, of hospitalization, the physical and mental stress on the family through that period is not only compensated now, it's also recognized. And we're recognizing that it was a gap because of the way the disability award was calculated at recovery.
So just one last question, Minister. This is not passed yet. In other words, it's in legislation. The Budget Implementation Act must pass for this to be implemented, the $70,000 tax-free benefit.
That's correct. The new benefits, which are contained in Bill C-58, the critical injury benefit, the retirement income security benefit, the family caregiver relief benefit. These are all new benefits that require parliamentary approval. As of April 1st, we already expanded inclusion in the permanent impairment allowance. We've fixed the earnings loss issue for Class A and Class B reservists. We were able to do those immediate fixes with regulatory change. But these three benefits are new. They require parliamentary approval. That's why I made the pledge to veterans and their families that they would pass this session. They were all contained in this committee's report last June, which is why when it seemed like there was not a willingness to move forward quickly on C-58, we've included it in budget implementation so that I can keep my commitment to veterans and their families.
Mr. Valeria.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, General, for appearing before us. Minister, thank you for the wonderful program that you included me in Netherlands. It was remarkable. I was speaking to the General before. It was just, frankly, an overwhelming emotional experience. And while both of you certainly earned the respect of everyone around this table, it does not at all mean that we agree with your approach to the solutions that our veterans need to the issues that are ailing them daily. You speak of C-58, and Mr. Stauffer's already addressed his concern about it not passing. My wager is that it's not going to get through this committee and back to Parliament and passed, not because we're delaying it, but because I don't think it's going to happen in time before this Parliament rises, which is regrettable. Having said that, Section 44 of that legislation, we've talked about this, defines those to whom this benefit, the single payment, the lump sum payment, defines those that are entitled to it. And it is a result of a single injury at a moment. And we've had the conversation about the fact that PTSD, essentially, PTSD sufferers are excluded from that because it isn't that single event. PTSD often arises later, manifests itself later. And quite rightfully, I've been at briefings and I've been told there are other benefits available to those who suffer from PTSD. But when, Minister, you do not define PTSD as a traumatic injury, which it is, okay, and do not provide for some form of lump sum kind of compensation for those people later, then you marginalize those people. And there are thousands. In fact, I'll bet you that the ministry doesn't know how many people are suffering from PTSD out there right now. We've had people like Jenny Mignot have to chase your predecessor for help. And I put to you, sir, that while there may be other programs that may be available to them, they are insufficient. Now, my question to you is this. You have indicated that while this does not completely close the gap, this legislation, it goes a long way in filling the gap. Even the Veterans Ombudsman appeared before this committee in April and said that while it is addressing some of the issues, it is not yet enough. It doesn't clearly meet all the needs of our veterans. Is it your proposition that this is all enough? And if it is all not enough and that there's more to do, why aren't you doing it? We've given you, in many, many reports, the things that need to be done. And the only thing I can think of that you're not doing it is because your Prime Minister has said, I'm sorry, Minister, this is all the money you're getting. I'm in austerity. I have to balance a budget in an election year, so we're not going to give you the money that's needed to complete all their needs. So what is it? Have you done everything that you can do? And if not, why not? Particularly for those suffering from PTSD.
Well, thank you, Mr. Valeriot. There was a lot there that I'll address in sequence. Certainly, I saw Madame Mignot here today, and I look forward to speaking more with her. I've already learned quite a bit from her perspective as a caregiver and the compassion she shows, and I appreciate those in the home helping people with operational stress injuries. Second, your statement, is this enough, and your pessimism about this bill not passing. I saw that sense that there would be delays in C-58, so that's why it's in the budget implementation. It will pass. I've made that commitment. Is it enough? As I said to Mr. Stouffer, fair criticism is to say there is more to do. In fact, when your party created the new Veterans Charter, I know you weren't in the Parliament when it was created, but it was intended to be a living charter. I've said repeatedly since I became minister that that's what it will be. And what I hope is that we pass C-58, which addresses some of the critical items this committee recommended. That's why I was hoping for swift passage. And then this committee could do what it did last year. In the future, look back and see, have the new benefits, the new reforms, the new programs in C-58 and in the last 2 years on mental health, have they been having their impact? And then plan a new set of priorities. That's how this committee should run. And as minister, I would count on that input to make sure that we're meeting the needs, not just today, but in the future. On PTSD, let me say this. In my work before I became a parliamentarian supporting military families, this was my area of focus. It is a huge priority for the government. By the end of this year, we'll have 26 operational stress injury clinics open across the country. The first one didn't open in Canada, Mr. Chair, until 2002. This is trying to address a growing need. When it comes to the critical injury benefit, what I've said to veterans is this benefit is open to any type of injury, physical or mental injury. And there is the possibility of somebody suffering post-traumatic stress from a single occurrence. The The issue with operational stress injuries is that no injury is the same, and no treatment regime that will help the veteran is usually the same. They're very individualized injuries. So this is inclusive. But what veterans should not do, and parliamentarians should not do, is start comparing physical injuries to mental injuries and saying if the critical injury benefit ends up being primarily for serious physical injuries, that's okay. We're trying to address the seriously injured. It's a tailored benefit that's not meant to apply to 700,000 veterans in Canada. At the same time, permanent impairment allowance is primarily paid to people with mental injuries from service. Is that inherently unfair to somebody with a physical injury? No, it is not. The new Veterans Charter tries to tailor financial support, medical support, and rehabilitation to the needs of the veteran, whether their injury is physical or mental. So it's not fair to compare who might qualify. It's about getting them the support they need.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. Hayes.
And formally, thank you both for your service. I've really never had the opportunity to do so, and my colleagues here, all of who have direct military experience on this side of the table, thank you guys very much for your service. I'm the only one that didn't have direct service, but my immediate family had 100 years of direct service. So I'm hoping, Minister, that I want you to confirm my understanding over something. This whole misinformation that's out there with respect to lapsed funding. I've taken the initiative to print out the public accounts over the course of the past 9 years, as well as the planning and priorities documents. And my observation as I'm looking at the figures is in 2005-2006, we had a budget of $2.85 billion, and in 2013-2014, that was up to $3.6 billion. So over the course of those 9 years, our budget, or our estimate of what we were going to spend each year, over 9 years, cumulatively, that was $30.6 billion, of which we actually spent $30 billion. So we actually spent 98% of our budget. But then during the course of the year, with the planning and priorities documents, I noticed that every year we asked for additional authorities, every single year. As a matter of fact, in 3 of those years, if we didn't ask for additional authorities, we would have actually exceeded budget, which I understand is not allowed. And the reality is all of those additional authorities weren't required. You know, a budget is an estimate. We want to make sure we have the funds. So we ask for additional funds because we want to make sure no veteran goes unserved. So my question, Minister, is in your opinion, the lapsed funding, that doesn't mean lapsed services in any way, does it? And does any veteran go unserviced because of a lack of funds within the Veterans Affairs Department?
Mr. Hayes, I'm very glad you asked this question because it has caused a lot of confusion for veterans and their families, and it's an issue that because of the moderate degree of complexity can be used to actually sow seeds of confusion. You're exactly right. A department cannot spend more than its estimated budget, its estimates. In fact, it does have to go back to Parliament to get more funds approved. So every department needs to estimate what they will spend and try to do it as accurately as possible. Estimates that make it within 1 or 2% of actual spend is actually very good budgeting. We don't know what actually goes out the door until the public accounts come in, which is over a year later. And then you try and learn from the public accounts where you did not spend. Veterans Affairs is a very unique department within the federal government in that of the $3.5 billion or so of a budget, 90% of that goes to payments to veterans and their families. 90%. And with statutory benefits, once a veteran or their survivor is eligible for that benefit, in most cases, it will be paid until the end of the life of that veteran. So in recent years, we've seen some lapsing funds where in the public accounts cycle, we don't actually spend what is fully estimated. The majority of that comes from the aging demographic of the traditional war veterans, World War II and Korea. And as Mr. Valeri so rightly noted, these inspiring gentlemen, we were with many of them. Oldest was 97 in the Netherlands, average age was 91 or 2. That generation, where 1.1 million Canadians served in World War II, is now in their late 80s to 90s. I'll give you an example how challenging this is, because a department will expect, the estimates does not anticipate veterans passing away over the course of the cycle. That will go into the estimate for the following year. So when we assumed government in 2006, there was approximately 230,000 World War II veterans in Canada. In the last year, it's around 90,000. Same with Korean War, about almost 15,000 when we formed government, and less than 10 now. We see most of the lapse fund coming from the fact that sadly we're losing a large number of our World War II and Korean War veterans. That's why these commemorations, the 70th of VE Day and of the liberation of the Netherlands and Juno last year, are so profoundly important. But in terms of lapse funds, this is why. Other programs that are demand-driven under the new Veterans Charter, for instance, in career transition or something like that, if those programs aren't being taken up as quickly or by as many veterans as we might like, that's where we actually have to learn and make changes. But with some lapse funds, it's due to the nature of the fact that 90% of our budget is statutory payments to veterans and their families.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur Chicoine, c'est à votre tour.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the Minister and the Deputy Minister for being here to answer our questions. Mr. Minister, you announced a few weeks ago that there was a hiring of rather 100 more auditors because the Auditor General had said that the whole process for veterans acquiring benefits was far too long. How much money was provided for in the budget for these new expenditures, for these new hires?
And I enjoyed sitting on this committee. You've been here since my time here, and I appreciate that. I made two specific announcements. One at CFB Valcartier, Quebec City, in relation to at least 100 case managers. It will be more than that, but you've hit the nail on the head. I'm getting final Treasury Board approval for the exact number, but it will be greater, hopefully quite a bit greater than 100. Same with the benefit adjudicators. I've used a minimum, a floor number. There will be more hired over the coming months. And they will be deployed. Going back to the case managers, we are going to try and look and see where there's additional acute need throughout the country and build in more flexibility to how case managers are deployed. So my announcement, I said we're going from an average of 1 to 40 ratio of case manager to client. We'll be going down to 1 to 30, but we're going to try and build in flexibility. The benefit adjudicators is directly related to what we learned from the Auditor General. As you said, there were some unacceptable delays in the processing of disability payments for those with mental injuries from service. That was unacceptable. What's interesting to note is we asked the Auditor General to look specifically at this issue. We were investing. Were our investments meeting our targets? They were not in terms of the processing of benefit claims. So our hiring of those adjudicators will try and bring down the wait times identified by the Auditor General to meet the departmental targets. Once we get through that backlog, we can then get to a point where we can start meeting our targets within 6 to 8 weeks, having a disability claim processed. The Auditor General did say that vocational rehabilitation, the retraining, the re-education, that sort of thing, was proceeding okay. But in terms of the financial benefit processing, we were not meeting our expectation. All these positions will be hired in the coming months, and they will be more than 100 in both categories.
Yeah, it's 100 over 5 years, but for this year, you don't have any numbers of de nouveaux gestionnaires de cas. Vous n'avez pas de chiffres cette année?
Don't have any numbers for this year?
By June, we hope to be hiring and then putting them in acute areas of need geographically as quickly as possible.
Concernant le transfert de l'hôpital.
With respect to the St. Anne Hospital transfer, it's been going on now 3 years ago, and it's been date after date that has been announced. Do you have any news to give to the committee with respect to the transfer of St. Anne? And how will you be involved in the transaction towards the government of Quebec? Do you have any news, any new developments with respect to the transfer of St. Anne de Bellevue?
As you well know, for many, many years, in fact, for many decades, there have been discussions with the government of Quebec with respect to St. Anne. We have an agreement in principle with the government in Quebec, and what's positive is, from our standpoint, veterans will continue to get exceptional care in that facility, and an added benefit after the transfer date. Some veterans who have a partner or spouse in a long-term care facility elsewhere in Quebec, now that it would be a provincial facility, will be able to reunite some couples who are right now spread out because of the nature of the facility. Quebec will be in the position of gaining a very modern, advanced, and world-class center for geriatric care that has been developed at St. Anne's over the last few decades, and they will be able to incorporate that into the provincial healthcare regime. It's a huge asset that I know many in Quebec are looking forward to, and our primary goal is to make sure that the veterans receiving care there will continue to get the world-class care they're entitled to and they deserve.
Donc, il n'y a pas de développement, si je comprends.
So I'm to take it there are no new developments with respect to the transfer. It's going back 3 years now. Are you on the point of actually doing it, or what? No information at all to relate to the committee?
The agreement in principle is set with the government of Quebec. As you know, the provincial government in Quebec is at the moment also restructuring their governance of healthcare and healthcare administration across the province. That will be part of the conversation leading up to the actual transfer date in the future. But an agreement in principle is struck, and I think both sides are satisfied that the needs of the veterans will be met, and at the same time, Quebec will be gaining a facility that is world-class and will integrate well into their provincial and regional system of health.
Mr. Hahn.
Thank you to both our witnesses for being here. And Minister, I want to thank you especially for relating your presentation to the actual legislation. And I do fully expect, as Mr. Lemieux has said, that as part of the BIA, when that rolls out, that section will come to this committee for discussion. That would just make sense. I just want to follow up a little bit on Mr. Hayes' point. And as you said, the process is entirely normal. Every government has followed the same process. In fact, in the last year that the previous government was in position, they lapsed $116 million from Veterans Affairs by exactly the same process. So this is absolutely normal. And the analogy I've used is it's like a line of credit. You get a line of credit. If you don't spend it all that year because it didn't get drawn down for whatever reason, then the line of credit gets renewed the next year. Is that a fair analogy?
That's a good analogy, absolutely. You draw upon it. Your goal is to clear exactly what you need. You then go back to Parliament if you think there's some special allocations needed, but your goal is to actually estimate exactly. But you should always estimate a little more so you don't have to go back to Parliament.
Absolutely. So to suggest that somehow veterans have been shortchanged by $1.3 billion over the last years is just plain false. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. You know, this is a story that every once in a while in a slow news cycle comes up. And with all departments, they will say where the government didn't spend money. It's actually a case where there was an estimate, and that estimate was not met. When it comes to Veterans Affairs, if you look on average, compared to when we formed government, about $700 million more each year is spent. It's just spent in many cases in different ways.
Any government department that the budget's within 2% is actually doing a pretty darn fine job. Is that also fair to say?
You know, I think Treasury Board and the process of the public accounts looks at this closely, and I think 1 to 2% is kind of the gold star that departments try and shoot for. As I said, you always want to be a little bit over, so you don't have to go back to Parliament for funds. But you don't want to be too much over, because then it really isn't a solid estimate. And if it is way too high, you should go back and say, where was our forecasting as part of the estimates off? So you should always learn from the estimates process and the public accounts. But in some cases, particularly as I mentioned to Mr. Hayes, the demographic changes of our World War II and Korean veterans, those you really can't build into the process. You just have to, each estimate cycle, try and readjust.
Thank you for that. And I want to actually follow that with the whole issue of this being a work in progress, that we're always going to be changing. In 1938, we didn't know we'd have hundreds of thousands of World War II vets. You know, 1949, we didn't know we'd have thousands of Korea vets. In 2000, we didn't know we'd have thousands of Afghan vets. So it is a work in progress, and we're always trying to adapt. And to a point that was made earlier about the Ombudsman briefing the committee in April about some of the things that weren't done, as I pointed out in the House yesterday, that was in April. In June, we tabled a report from this committee which contained 14 recommendations, all of which are being addressed. And you have brought in more measures beyond even what the committee had recommended, which is certainly laudable.
A point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead,
That report of which I spoke was April of this year, well after our recommendations were filed.
That's not
the
really
report of the Veterans
Thank you,
Ombudsman.
Mr. Villarian. Go ahead, Mr. Hong.
But I will, to that, point out that the Ombudsman also had praise for many of the things that were happening. Just as the Auditor General, as you pointed out just a few moments ago, pointed out some deficiencies, but also pointed out where things had gone well. So it's always going to be, my point is, it's always going to be a work in progress. We're always going to be trying to adapt. We're always going to be playing catch-up of some sort. So can you sort of put a little ministerial frame around that says, the challenge that you have, that the Department of Veterans Affairs has, with the constant changing, the constant unknowns. In 10 years, we'll say, gosh, we didn't know we'd have thousands of veterans from some other conflict.
Absolutely. I think the new Veterans Charter was created to try and focus on wellness. And each year we have about 1,200 men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces that release medically from service. In some cases, it's from a service injury. In a very small number of cases, thankfully, it's a very serious injury. It could be in operational theater, it could be in training. The old system, it was very important to be in a special duty area and injured. That's not the case now. At the end of the day, of those people, the goal has to be getting them to a good place post their military career. And the more ability they have to recover, to rehabilitate, and find new purpose and meaning in a second career, the more we have to facilitate that. And that was the goal of the Veterans Charter. Focus that financial support, that rehabilitation quickly to help with transition. Because if transition goes well, they leverage their military career into a great career after service. There are some that will have a very difficult time transitioning, whether from physical injury from service, mental injury from service. Those people need additional supports, clearly. That's why in 2011 our government introduced the Permanent Impairment Allowance Supplement. It's why Bill C-58 has the Retirement Income Security Benefit. It's why we're looking at the Critical Injury Benefit. This committee, in your report last June, said there should be a focus on those moderately to seriously injured veterans because they have the hardest time transitioning. So I have essentially followed the advice of this committee, of the Ombudsman and others, to try and target that. The less serious the injury, the more ability that the up to $75,000 of vocational rehabilitation training can get that person into a new career. As I say to a lot of veterans, there's three pillars to recovery. There's the health of the veteran, the wellness of their family, and the second career. Family I put in the middle because it's critical. If the second career doesn't go well, it affects the other two. So we try and focus. The living charter concept, we've built into C-58 with the purpose clause at Section 2, which is very similar to recommendation 2 of your report in terms of our ongoing obligation to our veterans and their families.
Mr. Minister, I know that you're anxious to hear from the questions that Mr. Lison will ask you, and so he has the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you to witnesses for coming here. Thank you for your service. Minister, I would also like to ask you first question to clarify something. Yesterday, during the debate, I listened to the speeches coming from the opposition, and there were speeches, and we were accused, or the government was accused of slashing funding for veterans. Can you clarify this? Is this true? Has our government decreased the funding for veterans?
No, as I said in an answer earlier, if you look at the comparison to spending when we formed government in 2006, we're spending on average about $700 million more, but we're spending it in different ways. I think all parliamentarians, including Mr. Stouffer, who's been here longer than I think anyone else, has seen the attention given to mental health. When I was in the Canadian Armed Forces, there was very little discussion of operational stress injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, as I said, the first operational stress injury clinic opened by the Canadian Armed Forces wasn't until 2002. So this is an area where we've been expending a lot of time and resources because it's a new area, and that if somebody gets support with a mental health condition or injury, they can get back on the road to wellness. We need to reduce the stigma. So we're spending, these clinics didn't exist even 15 years ago. Now we'll have 26 by the end of this year, and we will need to do more. So we're spending more, but we're spending in new ways. We're trying to build in flexibility to the system. As someone that came from the private sector, I say our department has a challenge that we're rising to meet. We have seriously injured veterans who are clients of Veterans Affairs in their late 20s and early 30s, as well as clients in their mid to late 90s. They have different needs, and they expect to draw their services from Veterans Affairs in different ways. That's an immense challenge, and why we're trying to build in flexibility into the system. Expanding more access points through Service Canada for that basic support, more home visits, the development of the MyVac online account, mental wellness apps for PTSD and operational stress. Older veterans, and I've even heard some parliamentarians, might mock an app for a phone. But the reality is a lot of our young Afghan veterans, they've never had a bank book in their life. They've done everything on their smartphone. So we have to appeal to what they expect in terms of service delivery. It's a challenge, but we've got an incredible team, and we're going to try and meet that challenge with flexibility.
And Minister, can you explain this committee the family caregiver benefit, how it will help the family members of veterans. You have addressed this yesterday during the debate, but if you can maybe explain it to this committee, it would really be a very beneficial.
Thank you, Mr. Lison. This is an important benefit, and I think it's part of several reforms we've done in recent years to try and provide more support for the family. And this is a living charter. I want to do more in the future because the family is so critical to the wellness of the veteran. We've expanded to allow veterans and their families to use family resource centers, expanded psychological counseling and support to family members, not just the injured service member. The family caregiver relief benefit is targeted at the most seriously injured, and it is to provide flexibility for those people that are informal caregivers in the home. I hope it will serve as the model of doing even more in the future. It's a little under $8,000 in terms of payment annually. We're trying to build it with as little administrative burden as possible because we know we don't want to make this paperwork intensive. It's to provide flexibility for that caregiver if they need to go and attend a child's graduation or a summer camp or have their own surgery, or they just need to recharge their batteries. If they want to get some extra professional help, if they want to fly in a family member, it's to be there as a tax-free grant just to provide some flexibility. Does it solve all problems? Absolutely no. But it's recognition that we know there's caregiver fatigue. I talk regularly to military spouses, the caregivers brigade, a range of people, and we're trying to do a number of things to support the family. Rehabilitative experts also say the more you can provide supports and not require that the spouse or partner to leave their vocation or job, the more that you make the supports there so that they make that choice on their own, because their wellness is important. And you don't want everyone leaving their career and part of their personal wellness in terms of supporting someone who's injured in the home. So I think it's an important first step.
We have time left, no?
Are you done?
Or there's some
You
time
still
left?
have it. You
Well,
still
if therefore the last question would be on the permanent impairment allowance, the expansion of the benefit, if you can maybe address that.
Yes, this committee in your report last June did say that the eligibility criteria for the permanent impairment allowance was too rigid. We've listened and loosened the eligibility requirements in terms of the assistance to daily living and some of the criteria factored into the qualification for this benefit. We did that as of April 1st. The result will be approximately 305 new people receiving this lifetime permanent impairment allowance benefit, likely in addition to other supports they're receiving from Veterans Affairs. So we listened to this committee, and I want to thank you for it.
Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the Minister and Deputy Minister both for being here at committee. Appreciate that. It's recently come to my attention that some military families are being told that they are no longer eligible for the Canada Child Tax Benefit while these families are stationed abroad. And not only that, but they're being put in arrears by Canada Revenue Agency for the CCTB amount that they've already received. So I'm hoping that you'll talk with your cabinet colleagues to rectify this situation. But given that the government has signaled its intention to vote in favor of yesterday's NDP opposition motion to recognize the sacred covenant or social covenant that exists between veterans and the government, does this mean that you plan to instruct the government lawyers to stop fighting veterans in court and reach an immediate settlement with those veterans who have launched the legal lawsuit against the government seeking this recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. It's good to see you here at the committee. I've spoken to my deputy, and we'll look into the Canada Child Tax Benefit issue. Obviously, that would be a Canadian Armed Forces issue, not a Veterans Affairs issue. I'm not familiar with the specific issue, but we'll look into it.
Thank you.
Going to your motion from yesterday, as I said in my speech that followed your speech, I thanked you for bringing the motion. I think any time we have a substantive debate on care for veterans and their families in the House of Commons, that's a good thing. As I noted in my debate, my first day as minister in the House, in response to my good friend Peter Stouffer, I quoted Robert Borden's words in relation to the just appreciation that Canada owes the men and women who serve us. This is almost a 100-year-old statement of the tremendous obligation, I describe it, that we owe to our veterans. It's not a frozen-in-time obligation, so we need to constantly look at the needs now and in the future. The motion you brought forward yesterday, I think, stimulated some good discussion in the House. As I said, it falls short, actually, of Section 2.1 of Bill C-58, our purpose clause, which builds in the specific language from Robert Borden that specifically speaks to all veterans, not just injured, and then has the fact that the clause itself must be liberally construed. In fact, that was a recommendation this committee made last year. So I was a little surprised your motion yesterday did not have that same construction in terms of the fact that the purpose clause, the obligation, must be liberally construed to promote a benefit of the doubt approach in terms of support for veterans and their families. So I think what we have in C-58 is superior on a few levels, but I'm glad we had almost a day of discussion in the House of Commons. We had some great personal stories from members of Parliament who've served, who have bases in their riding, who traveled to Vimy Ridge and have spent time with veterans. That was a very positive development. It's also a key reason why our government will be, I believe tonight, voting in favour of your motion, Mr. Donnelly.
Okay, thank you. I work closely with Equitas on that, so they're still very interested in knowing on the development of that motion. But they're still interested in knowing, of course, the class action lawsuit, where that's going to go. In the remaining time, just two questions. Will you commit, Minister, to separate Bill C-58 from the Budget Implementation Act so that this committee and the opposition can deal with this and move it forward in a timely manner, as opposed to bundling it with an omnibus budget bill? If that is the case, I think you'll find a speedy passage, and perhaps there is a possibility of getting it through, as opposed to putting it in with the BIA. Also, you mentioned earlier in your remarks that those veterans who have passed away, those funds have not been reinvested back into veterans programs. Could you comment about why that isn't the case? Why aren't they reinvested in existing programs?
Well, there's a few questions there. If I may, the first, in terms of Bill C-58 and the Budget Implementation Act, the Budget Implementation Act will ensure that I meet my commitment to veterans and their families about passing these benefits, these reforms, before Parliament rises. I've made that commitment. I think it's important. Since most of C-58 came from this committee, you know, I would love our House leaders to work together to have quick passage of C-58 standalone. The issue is my early feedback and what I heard in terms of comments on some of these new benefits was that was not going to be achieved. Even yesterday, I think yesterday your opposition day was really the first substantive response, if I could call it a response, to C-58 by your party. That was 6 weeks. As I said, the debate was a good one, but I can't allow delay, whether intentional or not, to fall into place to delay these benefits. As I've said, fair comment would be there's more to do, but that's not a reason to delay the benefits that are in C-58. So I've said I won't let that happen.
Mr. Opitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, and thank you, Minister, for being here. In general, it's always a delight to see you, sir. Just to follow up on something that call sign Hansky said earlier in terms of this being a living document, and it is. As we've seen between the wars over the last century, but also in just the last 30 years, a lot has changed. As the general will remember, back in the 70s and even 80s, I mean, if you had a cypress medal, your CD, and a set of wings, you were fully decorated. And nowadays, to look at the soldiers with the numbers of missions that they have, so much has changed just in 3 decades alone. So this is something we definitely need to bear in mind, and that's why this is so much a living document, and we have to address the concerns of our veterans as they go along, because things do change, and you need that flexibility to be able to adapt to it. So, Minister, I congratulate you on implementing and instilling that flexibility into the plan. Minister, you said earlier as well, as you talked about benefits and awards, you also used the word pension. And I'd like you to equate those words together and define what all of this adds up to in the end for a veteran on a program of benefits and awards.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Opitz, and thank you for your service for many years in the Canadian Armed Forces and the work you've done with veterans and on transition and hiring programs for vets. It's appreciated. I did say when I unveiled the Retirement Income Security Benefit, which, as I said, was a key priority of this committee, of the Ombudsman, of the Legion, NATO Vets, a number of organizations addressing this issue at 65 for moderately to severely injured veterans. At that time, I said, I want the department to move towards a predictable and understandable lifetime payment for our seriously injured. People understand what a pension is in terms of that permanency. With the new Veterans Charter, there are a lot of supports and benefits, but because, as I said in my remarks, they're stacked on top of one another, we have potentially 3 or 4 lifetime benefits, but they're different things stacked on top of one another. Permanent impairment allowance supplement, the retirement income security benefit. We need to streamline those into a single payment that's understandable for those veterans that are eligible. I think that will give them peace of mind. It will also allow Canadians to know that support is there. Where the Veterans Charter, as you slide down the scale of serious injury, mental or physical, the focus truly has to be on the rehabilitation piece. Income support through earnings loss, vocational rehab, retraining, re-education, to get into that second career, whether or not they also have accumulated pension time in the Canadian Armed Forces. If you joined at 18 and wanted to be a soldier, sailor, airman, or woman for the rest of your life, and an injury changes your plans at 32, what is the best option? Is if you can physically and mentally get into a new role, that's good for yourself, your family, and your future. Let's facilitate that. And so I think with these fixes, we're going to start getting the balance, as the committee said, not just working for most veterans. Most is not enough.
Now, your expertise, and you've worked, and I know through Patriot Love and other organizations, Canada Company, you focused on PTSD. But I don't think a lot of people really understand the work that's going forward in terms of wellness and the collaborative efforts we have with groups like SIMBAR and, in fact, DRDC itself, which is doing scientific work in trying to identify markers in an individual that may be prone to operational stress injuries, and that collaboration that's happening to try to address these issues but yet get ahead of that curve and address it ahead of missions as opposed to post-mission. Can you comment on some of that work that's being done?
I can. I have to say, without hesitation, the most rewarding part of the months I've been minister has been meeting other veterans helping veterans. As you said, I worked with some great organizations of Canadians, True Patriot Love, Canada Company, Travel Victor, Wounded Warriors, all doing great things. Some of them served, some of them didn't. In Esquimalt, I met a young master seaman who got out from an injury, Bruno Gouvernement. and within a year was already giving back and helping veterans. Met Fraser Holman, helping elderly veterans in Sunnybrook. Here was a former fighter pilot wearing a smock that says volunteer and helping veterans he never served with. And he was a retired general. The CIMVAR, the Center for Military and Veteran Health Research, run at Queen's and RMC, but has a network of, I think, 24 universities across the country, also run by a veteran, Alice Aiken. Alice and Stephanie, who run CIMVAR, are pulling together the resources. So University of Alberta doing some great physical rehabilitation work, other universities like University of British Columbia, which Dr. Marvin Westwood, who trailblazed the Veterans Transition Program. We need to reach out and try a total approach to wellness. On mental health, we're really doing that. We recognize that there is not one size fits all solution. So with CIMVAR, we have a pilot right now on service dogs that they're helping us lead, 50 dogs being deployed. We're also working with Pause for Thought, Medrick Kuzno, a decorated navigator from Sea Kings. So we're reaching out to some of this expertise and exploring pilots to say, can we bring more flexibility in programming to meet the needs of the veteran? Same with equine therapy with Can Praxis and the guys in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. Once we know of programs that offer some support for the veteran or the family, we then try and evaluate and see, can we make this available to more people beyond the pilot? Is it helping not just symptom relief, but helping the underlying condition? CIMVAR and the research element is critical so that we can really learn from these programs and learn how we can help more veterans as a result.
I noticed that when witnesses don't want to look at the chair, they don't look at the chair.
It's a fine-looking chair, too.
The minister has agreed to be here for 90 minutes, and I know some of you have obligations immediately after the meeting, but since the 90 minutes aren't up, and to be fair, I'd like to propose another round of questions, but each one has only 1 minute, and 1 minute means 60 seconds, including the response. And so, Mr. Stauffer, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very quickly then, on Bill 58 with the $7,000 grant for caregivers, would you be willing to revise that to match that to the attendant allowance of the 5 grades to at least give someone who has to leave their place of work at least some sort of livable income and respite care while they have it? Because $7,000, in my estimate, Mr. Minister, as nice as it is simply not enough for those who have to quit their job to care for people, and a higher allowance to the attendant allowance would be better appreciated, I believe. Would you accept that amendment?
What I think your question recognizes, Mr. Stauffer, is everyone's desire to plug new benefits and new programs under the new Veterans Charter into the old system. The attendance allowance and the family caregiver relief benefit are two different things, trying to accomplish different things. This is not intended to be an income support for somebody to leave their career. What the Veterans Charter also recognizes is in the 1950s and 60s, the military members and then veterans would usually have a spouse, usually a wife, going from base to base, not working, or and then retiring.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.
This is just about temporary relief. He's holding me to 1 minute.
Mr. Lemieux, you have 60 seconds.
Minister, you had referenced your consultations with other stakeholders, for example, through this committee, with the Ombudsman, and with witnesses, etc. You held a very important summit where there was further consultation. I'm wondering if you could just perhaps inform the committee about the summit and about those types of consultations that you've done that have helped lead to the legislation in front of Parliament now.
Absolutely, thank you, and I will try and keep short because I see the chair is holding me to it. We had a stakeholder summit that I think was probably the largest of its kind. It involved traditional membership-driven organizations as well as online peer support organizations. We had working groups. We actually developed ideas that came from the stakeholders, very well received. We talked about Bill C-58. It was well received. I want to do this twice a year so that we can hear from them. The online peer support groups like Send Up the Count brigade wellness groups. They are the new eyes and ears, and we're trying to help find a way that they can work.
Thank you, Minister.
With other
Mr. Valeria, you have the floor.
Minister, two questions quickly. Number one, you didn't tell us exactly how many caseworkers are being hired this year, not 100 over 5 years, this year, number one. And number two, last year I was able to determine that you spent $4 million in the spring on advertising more than previously estimated, and $5 million more in advertising in the fall, more than previously estimated. Will you undertake to tell this committee in writing to the clerk, because I couldn't find any of the estimates, how much money you're going to be spending more or less on advertising this year?
Yeah. You're making this hard in 1 minute, Mr. Valeria. Advertising, we estimate $3.5 million. That has a commemorative aspect, but it also has an important goal of advertising benefits. So some of the new Veterans Charter benefits not being taken up, we have to make sure more veterans take them up. I'm a strong defender of the last ads we ran because they also had the benefit of showing Canadians a young veteran, a young father, because we need more employers hiring veterans. On the case managers, hiring will commence very shortly, quickly, post-Treasury Board approval, and we will start working on a targeted basis.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Hayes.
Thank you very much for your role in hosting and organizing the second annual Sam Sharp breakfast. And if you care to make any comments, fine. If not, I just want you to know I enjoyed being there, and it was a tremendous experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Sam Sharp breakfast was started last year by Romeo and Dallaire and myself, long before I became minister, where we allow some veterans to come and talk about their own path to wellness after an operational stress injury or mental health injury. Sam Sharp was the MP from my area over 100 years ago who died as a result of his operational stress injury from World War I as a sitting MP. So we're using him as a teaching aid to say we've come a long way since Sam Sharp's time, but we've got a long way to go, and we need to talk about these things, get veterans who are suffering into good programs to promote overall wellness.
Mr. Chiquan.
Yes, to have access to the last post fund, there has to be $12,000 in terms of assets, 24,000, and then it was in 1995, and it was dropped to 12,000. But there are many families who do not have access to the last post fund. Would you be ready to establish a threshold of 24,000 so that more people would have access?
I'm very proud that our government a few years ago extended the last post fund, which traditionally was for World War II and Korean veterans, to all veterans, to modern veterans. It's critical to note that the $12,000 threshold that you talked about, I believe, is fair, because the $12,000 threshold does not include their house and does not include their car. So you're actually talking about a veteran that could have an estate worth far more in excess of $12,000 because those are carved out. So when you factor that into it, you realize it's not as unreasonable as some people make it sound like.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to follow up on the advertising a little bit. It was brought up actually by an opposition member yesterday that in the House that some veterans just don't know about the benefits. So advertising is important, and where else better to advertise than where veterans are actually going to be watching, like the Stanley Cup playoffs? Right. Could you comment on that?
Well, as I said, when you look at the estimates in the public accounts, and particularly in areas where there's benefits that are demand-driven that aren't being taken up, we need to educate men and women in uniform about that. We're trying to work with the Canadian Armed Forces to close the seam and let more of them know about these benefits before they leave the military. But we also have to advertise to make sure they take them up. The added benefit of the imagery chosen in the last ads was to also facilitate the hiring of veterans. We put priority hiring as a federal government. I'm proud we did that. But we need more people seeing these men and women leave the military as positive additions to their workplace, not just as a nice thing to do, but as very good for their bottom line. And that's the tone those ads had.
Minister, you just came back from Netherlands with your deputy, where you commemorated and celebrated 70th anniversary of the liberation of Netherlands. Can you tell us and inform us on the upcoming events to honor veterans?
Thank you. It was an amazing journey to accompany these living heroes. We had 67 veterans and a caregiver on our excursion, and to see the Dutch people continue their love affair with Canada because of the liberation was truly very special. We also have commemorated major milestones from World War I, including my friend from Guelph would know we just passed 100 years since in Flanders Fields, and there was a coin and stamp issued. We're also looking at, and I was just talking to my staff yesterday, about 20 years since Bosnia, and how we can mark and educate Canadians about that important role our Canadian Armed Forces played. So commemoration and remembrance is a critical part of our department, and we work on a year and a 5-year plan, making sure we mark and educate.
Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And regarding the Equitas lawsuit, class action lawsuit, with respect, you didn't answer my question yesterday in debate on this, and you didn't answer it today in committee. So I'm wondering if you will immediately instruct your lawyers to negotiate a settlement on this.
I have tremendous respect for the people that make up the Equitas Society, for Jim Scott, for Major Mark Campbell, Aaron Bedard. I've met and spoken with several of them. And as I've said, I never like to see someone who is frustrated to the point of going to court. And certainly, I feel that a lot of the reforms in C-58 has been the result of me not just listening here, but listening to their concerns and their demands. And I sincerely hope that they see C-58 as progress, that they see our purpose statement and our fulfillment of the obligation that they've talked about as to be a very positive
Mr.
step.
Opitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and reserves. The reserves have under you, Minister, gotten a lot, because I think we've realized how much reserves contribute to missions abroad, up to 25%, sometimes more, and key capabilities are in fact in reserves like CIMIC and PSYOPs and some of these other things. So I'd like you to elaborate a little further on some of the benefits and awards that are now offered to reservists on a parity level with the Rig Force.
Thank you. And as someone that served with some fine reserve units yourself, Mr. Opitz, you know the critical importance from coast to coast. Naval, Air, and Army reserves have always been. You know, we had a militia before we had a standing military. The respect for reserves, which was the day we described, Minister Kenny and I both did events talking about the reserves, talking about fixing that gap, the earnings loss benefit for Class A and Class B, but and you know, injury and death benefits. We tried to talk on a larger scale to educate Canadians on just how critical they are for our domestic and international operations. So we were fixing a narrow gap, but by calling the day Respect for Reserves, I met the father of a reservist in Vancouver a few days later. He said, "Thank you for talking about respect for our reserves." So it was very well received, and it's because I know the tremendous impact they make in our country.
Minister, I want to thank you very much for your participation in today's meeting. General, that was a tough question they asked you earlier. Alors, cette séance...
We are about to rise.
Call a vote on the estimates, but because of the clock, we'll do it on Thursday. La 49e séance du comité permanent.
The 39th sitting of this committee will be held on May 14th, Thursday, in room 112N from 9:30 to 10:30.
Session. Merci beaucoup de votre collaboration. See you next Thursday.